Imagine 400 million Indians under brutal Japanese occupation. This nearly happened. In 1942, the Japanese Empire was unstoppable. The Philippines, conquered. Singapore, fallen in just 7 days. Hong Kong, Malaysia, Indonesia, all captured with stunning efficiency. Burma, overrun, with British forces retreating in disarray. And then, at the doorstep of their greatest prize, Japan stopped. Why? The stakes couldn't have been higher. British India wasn't just another colony. It was the crown jewel that could have changed everything. With 1/5 of humanity under its borders and immeasurable resources, India represented the ultimate strategic prize. 3 million Indian soldiers had been mobilized to fight for the Allies. Massive industrial capacity, endless agricultural wealth, and a critical geographic position controlling the Indian Ocean. All of this was within Japan's grasp. Had Japan successfully invaded and occupied India, we might be living in a completely different world today. The Allied supply lines would have been severed, China would have been completely isolated, and the entire war effort against both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan would have faced a catastrophic setback. So what stopped the seemingly unstoppable Japanese war machine? In this video, we'll explore the fascinating confluence of factors that prevented what could have been history's largest military conquest. We'll examine Japan's military limitations, the extraordinary geographical challenges they faced, and the strategic priorities that ultimately guided their decisions. And the most surprising reason of all might be something that happened 700 years earlier in Japan's history. A historical memory that may have saved millions of lives. To understand this critical moment, we need to go back to Japan's grand strategy and the capabilities they brought to bear across the Pacific theater. By early 1942, Japan had stunned the world. In the aftermath of their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had executed one of the most successful military campaigns in history. Their stated goal was nothing less than the creation of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a vision of Asian liberation from Western colonial powers, with Japan, of course, as the dominant force. Emperor Hirohito faced an extraordinary dilemma. His military leaders had delivered victory after victory, expanding Japan's empire at a pace that astonished even the most optimistic war planners. But privately, he wondered if they had already overreached. In his personal diary, discovered decades later, he questioned whether the empire could actually control what it had so rapidly conquered. What Japan had accomplished was remarkable. In just 6 months, they had conquered more territory than Nazi Germany had managed in 3 years of European conquest. From the frozen north of China to the tropical islands of the South Pacific, the rising sun flag now flew over millions of square miles and hundreds of millions of people. But their greatest military genius knew a fatal mistake when he saw one. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, who had orchestrated Singapore's stunning capture, warned his superiors about the dangers of imperial overextension. "We have succeeded beyond our expectations," he reportedly told the Imperial General Staff. "But now we risk losing everything by reaching too far." The reality facing Japan was stark. Their empire now stretched across the vast Pacific, but their military resources were finite. By mid-1942, the Imperial Japanese Army had deployed approximately 3.1 million troops, but spread across a territory so vast that effective control became increasingly difficult. The human cost was already becoming apparent. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka wrote home from the Philippines, "We have conquered this land, but now we starve in it. Our supply ships come too infrequently. Half my men have malaria, and we have more territory than we can possibly patrol. But here's something everyone gets wrong about Japan's military power. Contrary to popular belief, in 1942, Japan wasn't militarily weak. They were at the height of their strength. Their navy remained formidable despite losses at Midway. Their air force still dominated the skies over much of Asia. And their army, while stretched, remained one of the most disciplined and effective fighting forces in the world. So if not military weakness, what really stopped them from invading the ultimate prize, India? To understand Japan's hesitation, we need to examine what stood between their forces in Burma and British India, one of the most formidable natural barriers on Earth. The border region separating Burma from India features some of the most challenging terrain imaginable for military operations. Dense mountainous jungles where annual rainfall can exceed 200 inches, steep valleys cut by raging rivers that flood during monsoon season, mountain passes rising to over 10,000 feet, impenetrable bamboo forests harboring deadly diseases from malaria to typhus. Military historian Dr. Robert Lyman called it perhaps the most challenging terrain for invasion in military history. He noted, Alexander the Great turned back from India not because of military defeat, but because of the formidable natural barriers and the toll they took on his men. The soldiers who fought there had their own name for it. Green Hell. Captain James Williams of the British 14th Army wrote in his memoir, "The jungle was our true enemy. Men would disappear into the vegetation and never return. Each morning we'd wake to find leeches had feasted on us during the night. The rain never stopped, the mud never dried, and everything, weapons, food, clothing, rotted away before our eyes. But Japan had conquered impossible terrain before. They had fought through the mountains of China and the jungles of Malaya. Their soldiers were renowned for their ability to endure extreme hardship. So what made the Burma-India frontier different? The reality of the Burma campaign reveals the answer. By early 1944, when Japan finally attempted a limited offensive toward India at Imphal and Kohima, the results were catastrophic. In what became known as the Stalingrad of the East, Japanese forces were decimated not primarily by enemy action, but by the logistics of fighting in such hostile terrain. Lieutenant General William Slim, commander of the British 14th Army, faced a seemingly impossible situation. His forces were outnumbered, with Japanese units threatening to cut them off completely. Yet through brilliant defensive positioning that utilized the challenging terrain, Slim's forces, predominantly made up of Indian soldiers, not only held their ground, but eventually forced a Japanese retreat. Most history books get this completely wrong. They focus on the battles themselves, but miss the devastating impact of the environment. Of the approximately 85,000 Japanese soldiers who participated in the Imphal-Kohima offensive, over 53,000 became casualties, and most died not from bullets, but from starvation and disease. Japanese supply lines stretched through hundreds of miles of jungle with no roads capable of supporting vehicles. Everything had to be carried by pack animals or human porters, many of whom succumbed to the same conditions decimating the combat troops. "We cannot advance," wrote Japanese Colonel Masahiko Takeshita in his final dispatch before dying of malaria. "We cannot retreat. We can only die here in this green prison." But could India's independence movement have changed everything? What if millions of Indians had risen up to welcome Japanese forces as liberators from British rule? The British had a serious problem in India, one that Japanese intelligence was keenly aware of. By 1942, the Indian independence movement had gained tremendous momentum, particularly after Mahatma Gandhi launched the Quit India movement, demanding immediate British withdrawal. Even more concerning for the British was Subhas Chandra Bose, a charismatic Indian nationalist who had escaped British custody and made his way to Nazi Germany, and eventually to Japanese-controlled Singapore. There, Bose formed the Indian National Army, INA, with a stunning recruitment pool. Indian soldiers captured by Japan during the fall of Singapore and Malaya. The numbers are staggering. Approximately 40,000 Indian prisoners of war joined Bose's army, swearing allegiance to the cause of Indian liberation with Japanese support. Standing before his newly formed army in Singapore, Bose delivered his famous rallying cry, "Give me blood, and I shall give you freedom." Japanese strategists saw enormous potential in this alliance. Their propaganda broadcast to India proclaimed, "Japan has no territorial ambitions in India. We come only to help you throw off the British yoke, as we have done throughout Asia." But the reality proved far different from Japanese expectations. While millions of Indians certainly desired independence, relatively few were willing to embrace Japanese liberation. The brutality of Japanese occupation elsewhere in Asia had not gone unnoticed, and many Indian leaders, including Gandhi himself, explicitly rejected the idea of achieving freedom through alliance with fascist powers. Yet even with the potential for some Indians to welcome them as liberators, Japan hesitated. Why? The answer lies in the formidable British control mechanism still operating throughout India. Despite growing nationalist sentiment, the British maintained approximately 200,000 British troops in India, alongside over 2.5 million Indian soldiers who remained loyal to the British Crown. The colonial administration continued to function effectively, and when the Quit India movement gained momentum, British authorities arrested over 100,000 activists, including most of the senior Congress Party leadership. The human dimension of this conflict created impossible situations. Consider Captain Anand Singh of the British Indian Army. "My father was imprisoned for supporting Gandhi," he wrote to his brother. "Yet here I am, fighting for the British against the Japanese. I do this not because I love Britain, but because I have seen how the Japanese treat those they conquer. Better the devil we know than the one we don't." What would you have done in this impossible situation? Fight for continued colonial rule or risk Japanese occupation? The British had an unexpected advantage no one talks about. Despite growing nationalist sentiment, many Indians viewed the Japanese Asia for Asians propaganda with deep skepticism. The brutal Japanese treatment of civilians in China, the Philippines, and Singapore had not gone unnoticed. But even if Japan could somehow overcome these challenges, the geographical barriers and uncertain Indian support, they faced an even greater problem that ultimately determined their strategy. By mid-1942, Japan was fighting a war on multiple fronts that stretched their resources to the breaking point. This forced Imperial Japanese headquarters to make critical decisions about where to allocate their increasingly stretched military assets. The numbers tell the story. Of Japan's 3.1 million troops, approximately 1.8 million remained committed to China, a campaign that had already been raging for 5 years with no end in sight. Another 800,000 was spread across the newly conquered Pacific territories. The remainder were either in defensive positions in the home islands or constituted a strategic reserve that was rapidly diminishing. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant naval commander who had orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack, offered a prophetic warning that haunted Japanese strategic planning. Before the war began, he had cautioned, "I can guarantee to run wild for 6 months to a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." By the time Japanese planners were considering an India invasion, Yamamoto's prediction was already coming true. The tide was turning in the Pacific, and Japan faced an increasingly assertive American counteroffensive. This recently declassified document changes everything we thought we knew about Japan's strategic thinking. The Imperial Navy's intelligence branch provided a stark assessment. American industrial capacity is converting to war production at a rate that will exceed our entire national output by a factor of 10 within 18 months. Our window of opportunity to secure defensive perimeters is closing rapidly. So where did India actually rank in Japan's strategic priorities? According to the Imperial Conference minutes from May 1942, the priority list was clear. Secure resource-rich areas, oil from Indonesia, rubber from Malaya. Establish defensive perimeter in the Pacific to prevent American counterattack. Resolve the China incident once and for all. Only then consider operations toward India or Australia. The ongoing quagmire in China consumed Japanese resources at an alarming rate. More Japanese soldiers died fighting in China than in all other theaters of the war combined, over 450,000 by the war's end. The Chinese forces under both nationalist and communist leadership employed a strategy of trading space for time, drawing Japanese forces deeper into the continent while avoiding decisive battles. Colonel Matsui Hidenobu wrote from his headquarters in Nanjing, "We have captured every major city, every port, every railway. Yet the enemy melts away only to return once we have passed. We control nothing but the ground beneath our feet." His observation reflected a growing realization among Japanese commanders. They were winning battles, but losing the war of attrition. This reality created an emotional toll that is often overlooked. In a single month in 1943, over 20,000 Japanese families received the dreaded telegram informing them that their son, husband, or father would not be returning from China. Each death further strained Japan's already limited manpower. Japan was learning the lesson that every empire in history failed to heed. Imperial overextension inevitably leads to collapse. The Romans discovered this in Germania, Napoleon in Russia, and now Japan across the vast Pacific. There are limits to military power, no matter how formidable the fighting force. The British military theorist B.H. Liddell Hart observed, "Japan's defeat became inevitable, not when they lost battles, but when they conquered too much territory to defend effectively." This assessment perfectly captures the strategic dilemma Japan faced when considering an Indian invasion. But there's one more factor in Japan's decision-making that's rarely discussed. A historical memory that may have influenced their strategic thinking more than we realize. In the 13th century, the tables were turned. Japan faced invasion from the greatest empire the world had ever seen, the Mongols under Kublai Khan. Twice, in 1274 and 1281, the Mongol Empire launched massive naval invasions of Japan. Both times the Japanese fought bravely but were ultimately saved when massive typhoons, which they called kamikaze or divine wind, destroyed the Mongol fleets. This historical memory ran deep in Japanese culture. For centuries, the kamikaze was seen as proof of divine protection for the Japanese homeland, that Japan was destined to be unconquerable. But it also provided Japanese military planners with a historical lesson about the difficulties of amphibious invasions across difficult waters, especially during monsoon season. Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma, who had commanded the successful invasion of the Philippines, wrote a memorandum to imperial headquarters in June 1942. We must consider the lessons of our own history. Just as the mighty Mongols found that conquering Japan required more than military superiority, we must recognize that India presents challenges that may exceed our current capabilities. Japanese military academies extensively studied the Mongol invasion attempts, analyzing how the world's greatest land empire had failed in its maritime campaigns. These lessons were not lost on the generation of officers now planning operations across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The cultural memory of invasion and its difficulties created a psychological framework through which Japanese planners viewed their strategic options. They had become the empire reaching across waters to conquer, but their historical experience was as the nation successfully resisting such conquest. How does historical memory shape modern strategy? In Japan's case, it may have created a more realistic assessment of the challenges involved in projecting power across significant maritime and geographic barriers, especially when faced with determined resistance. This cultural perspective provided yet another reason for caution when Japanese planners considered the enormous challenges of invading a subcontinent as vast and complex as India. As we've seen, Japan's decision not to invade India resulted from a complex interplay of factors. The forbidding geography of the Burma-India frontier presented logistical challenges that even Japan's highly disciplined army couldn't overcome. The uncertain response from the Indian population meant that Japan couldn't count on widespread support for their liberation. Strategic overextension across the Pacific forced Japanese planners to prioritize more immediate concerns, and perhaps even Japan's own historical memory influenced their assessment of the invasion's feasibility. The implications of this non-invasion are staggering. Had Japan somehow overcome these obstacles and successfully occupied India, millions more would have died in a war that already claimed over 60 million lives worldwide. The Allied supply lines to China would have been completely severed. Britain might have been forced to seek terms with Nazi Germany to focus on reclaiming its crown jewel. And the entire trajectory of post-colonial Asia would have been fundamentally altered. When we look at pivotal World War II decisions, we often focus on dramatic moments like D-Day or the Battle of Midway. But sometimes, the decisions not to act, the invasions not launched, the campaigns not pursued, shaped our world just as profoundly. The question we should really be asking isn't just why Japan didn't invade India, but what this decision tells us about the limits of military power, the importance of geography, and the complex calculations that shape strategic decision-making. Japan's greatest defeat may have been a battle they never fought. By overextending their empire across the Pacific, they created vulnerabilities that the Allies eventually exploited. Their decision to stop at India's doorstep wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was a recognition, perhaps too late, of imperial overreach. What other pivotal WW2 decisions shaped our world today? Share your thoughts in the comments on what would have happened if Japan had invaded India. Would they have succeeded? Would it have changed the war's outcome? Or would it have simply accelerated Japan's defeat? Sometimes, history's most important moments are the ones that never happened.
Remember to ring that notification bell, because next week we're exploring another incredible story that most history books won't tell you about. This is Bytes of Goats, where we don't just talk about history, we learn from it. See you in the next one.